Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Wave your hands. Excellent. We're off to a very good start. Okay. So, make sure I have so many wires. Please forgive me. This is coming out of every corner. But good evening. Hello. Thank you for creating the great energy for us to have a good talk this evening. I feel very honored to have been invited by Tokai University, their UNESCO youth team, and of course the wonderful co-organizing partners of this 9th UNESCO Youth Seminar pre-event. So please allow me a moment to express my very deep thanks to all of the co-organizers and to you. On behalf of UNESCO, I would like to congratulate you for your leadership, for your solidarity, for your passion, for convening these critical discussions on and with young people concerning their education. So there are 6 parts to my presentation this evening. I'll start by looking at the concept of gender equality, reminding us of its importance, and hopefully establishing a shared understanding of this important human rights issue. Then, we'll spend some time wearing our gender lenses so we can better see and recognize gender inequality in the world around us. We'll move on to the first step in addressing gender inequality, which is to identify and respond to its root cause. We'll look at the role of comprehensive sexuality education, CSE, as an essential contribution to gender transformative education, including with some good practices and examples. We'll look briefly at how gender transformative education and gender equality feature in global education commitments and why this is important for championing this issue. And then I'll conclude with a few key messages that I hope will help to stimulate our further discussion. How to begin a conversation about gender equality? Often, we begin the definition. The words and concepts we use to talk about gender are constantly evolving. Some of the terms and language that I will use today have different meanings across and within cultures. There are terms that may even be considered out of date in just a few years from now. There are terms that have no direct translation in some languages. All of these are things we need to navigate and agree on as a first step. Here is a definition of gender equality developed by Plan International, Transform Education, UNGAI, and UNICEF from a 2021 publication. In this definition, gender equality requires equal enjoyment by women, men, girls, boys, and gender minorities of socially valued goods, opportunities, resources, and rewards. It means that all persons, regardless of their gender, enjoy the same status in society, have the same entitlements to all human rights, enjoy the same level of respect in the community, can take advantage of the same opportunities to make choices about their lives, and have the same amount of power to shape the outcomes of those choices. In this definition of gender equality, we see that we are not narrowly talking about equal representation or participation of women and men. This is what we refer to as gender parity, which remains important. Neither are we only talking about the needs and experiences of diverse gender identities who fall outside of the binary notion of women and men. What we are talking about is the human right of each individual to achieve their fullest potential without limitation or exclusion on the basis of their gender and how their gender is expressed. Equal human rights of all individuals, regardless of their gender. This sounds like a wonderful thing, right? It's something that we should all be speaking up about and working together to promote and to protect. But focusing clearly on achieving gender equality requires that we are able to recognize gender inequality when it is happening around us. Identifying gender inequalities can sometimes be like that eye test at the optometrist. We know that something doesn't seem exactly right, but we can't quite say what it is. To better be able to see gender inequality, to bring it into focus, we need to put on our gender lenses. When we put on our gender lenses, here is what we are better able to see. The different expressions of gender inequality that surround us in our everyday lives, from the most subtle to the most obvious. Here are a few examples from the education system. Wearing our gender lenses, we can see that the representation of women in science, engineering, technology and maths, STEM, remains low. According to 2023 figures by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics, women make up only 35% of tertiary education STEM graduates around the world, a proportion that has stayed the same for the past 10 years. In 50 out of 54 countries, girls are less likely to get top marks in mathematics in primary school and higher education. This despite performing better than boys at school overall. In recent years, there has been considerable investigation in gender bias in the algorithms that drive artificial intelligence, including in the 2019 UNESCO report, I'd blush if I could, that shines a light on how AI forces a synthetic female voice and personality to defer questions and commands to higher and often male authorities. When we think and speak in binary expressions of gender and gender equality, we are also contributing to the marginalization of persons who may not identify as male or female. Gender non-binary or gender queer people are made invisible in statistical surveys and routine surveillance data. At the same time, depending on their formulation, questions in surveys on characteristics such as sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression can be intrusive and trigger persecution fears, most obviously in countries with hostile legislation for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, or queer, LGBTIQ+ people. Countries around the world struggle to address sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in school curricula. And that is true even in curricula that is especially intended to teach these topics. our gender lens, we become more aware of the gender patterns of violence. Gender-based violence, both in school and in society, is one of the most alarming manifestations of gender inequality. School-related gender-based violence happens within same gender groups and between different gender groups. And while students of any gender can experience and perpetrate violence in educational settings, the manifestations of violence differ along gender lines. Girls are more likely to face sexual and psychological violence. Boys are more likely to be both the perpetrator and the target of physical bullying and physical attacks. Boys are also more likely to experience harsh forms of discipline carried out by teachers, such as corporal punishment. Students who identify as or who are perceived to be LGBTIQ+ experience higher rates of school violence than their peers who conform to the prevailing social expectations of gender. In terms of online violence, girls and gender diverse people are more likely to experience sexualized hate and threats in many contexts. Data from a 2018 Global Education Monitoring Report policy paper showed that globally, 42% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth reported having been ridiculed, teased, insulted, or threatened at school because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, and that primarily by their peers. About 37% reported feeling rarely or never safe at school. So why have we not yet achieved gender equality? We know from evidence that there are effective interventions that respond to manifestations of gender inequalities. For example, quota systems in institutions that reserve a certain number of spaces and positions to ensure equal representation of males and females and gender diverse people. When we do these interventions by themselves, we do not have the kind of long-lasting change that we want, because they do not address the underlying problem. Real prevention of gender inequality involves targeted approaches to address harmful gender norms, biases, and stereotypes. As a reminder, gender norms are those deeply entrenched and widely held social expectations or informal rules about how each gender should behave. Gender norms often masquerade as culture or tradition, and there are persons and groups who defend these norms by invoking a sense of heritage that these practices define who we are. Gender norms do not necessarily have to be harmful. The challenge is their stereotypical content, how they are transmitted, and the discrimination they can cause. Harmful gender norms act as boxes that define and set the boundaries on how we expect people to act, depending on society's idea of what is considered appropriate behavior or characteristics of boys and girls. Persons who express themselves outside of those binary gender boxes face social sanctions. Gender norms also disproportionately allocate power to certain genders, historically favoring a male-dominated control of power over other genders. This power imbalance perpetuates systemic inequality, influencing various aspects of life, including economic or education opportunities, including reproductive health and rights, political representation, and social standing. The impact of gender and power is intertwined with other factors. Because no individual falls in a single category, it is crucial to also look at the way that individual characteristics, such as gender, intersect with other characteristics, such as age, ethnicity, disability, wealth, and more. I'm speaking, of course, about the concept of intersectionality. I'd like to highlight this interesting study carried out by Plan International Japan. In 2022, they published findings of a survey on gender stereotypes that they conducted among 2,000 high school students aged 15 to 18 that included all genders, girls, boys, and children with diverse gender identities other than male and female. Many high school students had experienced, by seeing or hearing, gender stereotypical expressions and comments in various places. 70% of students had experienced this at school. Major examples of expressions and comments included "do housework" or "be ladylike" for girls, and "don't cry," and "you have to be good at sports" for boys. Girls and those who self-identified as other than male or female had more experiences like this. In response to the question, do you feel that gender stereotypes limit your possibilities? Over 70% answered, I think so, or I tend to think so. In addition, students with genders other than male tend to be more likely to feel the negative effects of gender stereotypes. While it may be easy to assume that harmful norms are only held by one gender about another gender, we can see from these findings the need to change limiting beliefs and stereotypes that males, females, and gendered non-binary people have about themselves. So, who is impacted by harmful gender norms? The answer? Everyone. And what do these negative impacts look like? Harmful gender norms limit opportunities by restricting individuals from pursuing their interests and potential careers based on traditional expected roles, by reinforcing stereotypes, perpetuating biases and inequality, and making it difficult to challenge preconceived notions. Conforming to rigid gender norms can lead to mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, as individuals may feel pressured to fit into the boxes of prescribed roles. Gender norms contribute to inequality and discrimination as they can justify unequal treatment, lower pay, reduced opportunities, particularly for women and marginalized gender identities. Strict gender norms may stifle self-expression and authenticity, making it challenging for individuals to explore their true identities and preferences. Gender norms can affect interpersonal relationships, whether romantic or non-romantic, by creating unrealistic expectations and dynamics that may lead to conflict or misunderstanding or lack of trust. The good news is that we know that it is possible to change gender norms. Evidence shows that this can be achieved even within a single generation. Isn't it encouraging to know that we have that collective power? On screen is the gender equality continuum that shows how gender equality can exist on a sliding scale. Ideally, we only want to be going in one direction, from left to right, towards gender transformative approaches. Although sometimes we slide and go backwards. At any given moment, we should see on this scale which one of these categories our actions are contributing to. Are our efforts gender exploitative, gender blind, gender sensitive, gender responsive, or gender transformative? The intention should always be to avoid actions that are exploitative or which reinforce harmful gender norms, and ultimately to contribute towards gender equality by being gender transformative. So, what do gender transformative actions actually look like? I'll use an example from the education sector. Education has a massive transformational power. Gender transformative education moves beyond simply improving access to education for disadvantaged gender groups, and specifically seeks to utilize all parts of an education system, from policies to pedagogies to community engagement, in order to transform stereotypes, attitudes, norms, and practices by challenging power relations, rethinking gender norms and binaries, and raising critical consciousness about the root causes of inequality and systems of oppression. In the formal education system, there are different curricula, of course, many curricula, that teach about human rights and gender equality. But because gender is so intricately linked to other aspects of our identity, including our gender expression and sexuality, I'm going to zoom in on comprehensive sexuality education, CSE. Different countries refer to this curricula by different names, such as relationships education, family life education, HIV prevention education, life skills education, or education for healthy lifestyles. What actually is important is what young people learn in these subjects, when they learn it, and how. At the beginning of the seminar, you received a handout of a CSE lecture map. Here's my copy. Do you have yours? Excellent. And this was developed by several partners and published by the Sexuality and Culture Project here in Japan. This lecture map is a wonderful interpretation of the 8 key concepts of CSE that are outlined in the UN International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, and how these teaching and learning concepts holistically come together to support young people's happiness and their well-being. The transformative aspect of CSE is that it begins early and takes a stepwise approach to learning that follows the development of the child, with content that is age-appropriate and logically sequenced to become increasingly complex with age and development. It targets multiple domains of learning, knowledge, attitudes, and skills. It particularly emphasizes social and emotional learning, SEL, which numerous studies show fosters respectful and supportive peer relationships, reduces rates of bullying of students with diverse abilities and students from marginalized ethnic and migrant backgrounds, reduces rates of school-related gender-based violence, improves social capabilities, and improves help seeking for oneself and for others. Transformative CSE also prioritizes collaborative learning strategies and centers on students' voices and their feedback. And like all good quality teaching and learning, it must be delivered in safe and welcoming classrooms by teachers who are trained and supported and resourced to carry out their work. In the next few slides, I'll highlight just a few good practices of gender transformative CSE. First, we need to lay a foundation for gender transformative sexuality education at a young age. This is because the evidence shows that gender norms and gender socialization start as early as the age of 3. And by the time we reach adolescence, which begins at age 10, that gender socialization intensifies and starts to take root, including in the form of gender stereotypes. We have country examples of how education systems recognize the importance of teaching about gender equality at an early age. Here is an example of gender equality within primary school education in Quebec, Canada, where sexuality education has been an official part of the curriculum for almost 40 years. Since 2018, primary school learners receive 5 to 10 hours of compulsory sexuality education per year, integrated across various core subjects. For ages 6 to 7, the curriculum supports learners to understand the concept of gender roles and express themselves beyond stereotypes, fostering respect for differences. For learners aged 8 to 10, the focus is on recognizing and reflecting on gender stereotypes in their personal and social and media environments, considering their impacts on personal identity and relationships. Learners aged 11 to 12 gain an understanding of how gender-based discrimination negatively affects people and reflect on how they can play a role in reducing gender stereotypes and gender discrimination. Secondly, we need to improve CSE that responds to young people's needs and realities. In 2020, a review carried out by UNFPA, UNESCO, our office, and IPPF, we asked more than 1,400 young people aged 15 to 24 in a survey among 27 Asia-Pacific countries about their experience of school-based CSE. When we asked them what kinds of topics they wanted to learn more about in school, but actually did not learn, here is what they said. The top-ranked topic was on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. And the lowest-ranked topic was on disease prevention. That is, information about sexually transmitted infections. Thirdly, we need CSE that empowers young people through both cognitive and non-cognitive learning, with teachers and caregivers who listen to what they have to say about gender equality. Whether it is inside or outside of the classroom, the conversations that we have with young people about gender equality must build their understanding about gender, their value for respectful relationships, their critical thinking skills to recognize gender inequality, their empathy skills on why this inequality is unacceptable, their communication skills to speak up safely their agency skills, that they believe they have the power to take action, and their practical skills to know how to do so. For the last few years, our education team at UNESCO Bangkok has been working with young people in Asia to empower them to speak up and take action on gender inequality. In all cases, this starts with a skills-building workshop on analyzing gender norms and their root causes. We are continuously inspired to hear what young people have to say about how they can and are already supporting gender equality. Most recently, we have been partnering with youth organizations to support their advocacy on LGBTIQ+ inclusive learning spaces, both in Thailand and Singapore. And next year, we are excited to partner with young people in the Philippines and here in Japan on this initiative. In closing, I would like us to recall that gender transformative education, including through CSE, is not just a dream, but an expectation already expressed in various education commitments. Firstly, in Sustainable Development Goal 4 itself, specifically Target 4.7, that calls for education that promotes gender equality as part of the vision for countries' sustainable development. UNESCO's recommendation on education for peace, human rights, and sustainable development, developed in 1974 and revised in 2023, highlights the what and the how of teaching and learning in all types and at all levels of education. It reaffirms an understanding of positive peace as being more than the absence of conflict, and gives prominence to gender equality as one of 14 guiding principles of quality, inclusive education. And while this is a non-binding legal document, the new recommendation is the only global standard-setting instrument that lays out how education should be used to bring about lasting peace and foster human development. This recommendation was unanimously adopted by all 194 UNESCO member states at the 42nd session of the General Conference in 2023 and launched in Asia Pacific in June this year. And it will form part of routine education monitoring to follow how countries are fulfilling their commitment on this type of education. The recommendation is also the first international standard-setting instrument to use the language comprehensive sexuality education, stating that all learners should be empowered through comprehensive sexuality education that is non-discriminatory, evidence-based, scientifically accurate, relevant to the cultural context, and age-appropriate. This focuses on building the knowledge of reproductive health and infection prevention, as well as the cognitive, social, emotional, and behavioral skills for healthy, respectful, and equitable relationships. Finally, please allow me to leave you with a few key messages that I hope you'll take away with you. The language we use to talk about gender equality can either open up or close down our conversations. It is important to arrive at a shared understanding, and this can include using language that affirms diverse gender identities beyond the binary. A first step in addressing gender equality is to be able to recognize gender inequalities. We do this by putting on our gender lenses, making gender diverse identities more visible in data and evidence, and considering gender inequality in relation to power dynamics and intersectionality. To have impactful and sustainable change for gender equality, we must address the root cause of harmful gender norms. Gender-based discrimination, whether it's against women and girls, men and boys, or persons of diverse gender identities and expression, all share the same root cause, harmful gender norms, which negatively affect everyone, individuals and societies. Gender norms can and do evolve over time. Harmful gender norms can be changed, especially through the transformative power of education. Gender transformative education helps us to rethink gender norms, raises our awareness about the root causes of gender inequality, and builds skills to take action to address this issue. Good quality CSE makes an important contribution to gender transformative education and is recognized in our global vision of education that supports peace, human rights, and sustainable development. And finally, but not the least, young people demand and deserve gender transformative CSE as part of their right to quality, inclusive education. This is education that builds a foundation for happiness, life, and love, that responds to their diverse needs and realities, and that we must co-create together with them. Thank you very much.
はい、ジェネルさん、とっても充実した講義をどうもありがとうございました。ちなみにジェネルさんはこの包括的セクシャリティ教育、包括的性教育の、普及開発に、尽力された方でもいらっしゃって、ご自身の講義の中でもあった国際セクシャリティ教育ガイダンスという世界中で使われている包括的セクシャリティ教育のガイドラインですねの、作成にも大きく関われた方でいらっしゃって、こうやって日本でねお招きできてとても嬉しいなというふうにも改めて思っております。ありがとうございます。ではこれからパネルトークに移っていきたいと思います。私の方からですね、日本のアクティビストの方を、はい、わかりました。会場からもしよろしければご質問ぜひジャネルさんに聞いてみたいという方いらっしゃったらこの場でぜひ教えていただけたらと思うんですけれども、どなたかご質問ある方いらっしゃいますか？じゃあどうぞ。
Thank you very much for today, and I'm glad to hear about this speech. I have a question about why you use gender equality rather than gender equity. I'm just curious about that.
This is the best question. It's the best question to start the discussion with, and it also links back to where I started the presentation about how terminologies that perhaps in one language, like English, might have nuance. In other languages, that nuance needs to be constructed through more words or more steps. So the ultimate goal that we're aiming for is gender equality. Gender equity is a step, a process step on the way to gender equality. We want equality in the outcome between all genders. Gender equity is about fairness, that it's fair to give people same opportunities. But the limitation of gender equity is that sometimes you can't give everybody the same thing and achieve gender equality because they have different needs and they're starting from different places. And if you go on Google, there's a wonderful little cartoon animation about gender equity versus gender equality. And it shows people standing on boxes. I don't know if any of you have seen that. That's a great comic to express it. So we try to be fair, and we give everyone the same thing. We're being equitable. But if everyone is a different height, or one person can't stand at all, giving them the same thing doesn't allow them to have an equal outcome. So we recognize the unique needs of individuals and give them what they need so that they can all have the opportunity to see what's going on. So looking over a fence, for instance. That is the equality of the outcome. So equity is very important. We can't skip over it, but we're actually aiming for equality.
はい、とても丁寧に語っていただきました。ありがとうございます。どこかぜひこの機会ですので、ご質問ある方いらっしゃいますか？どうでしょうか？手を挙げていただけたらと思います。ありがとうございます。じゃあマイクオフしますね。
日本語で大丈夫ですか？大丈夫ですか？若者には、結構性教育とかジェンダーのこととか浸透してると思うんですけれど、結構親の世代とかになるとそういうのが浸透してないなっていう印象を受けていて、若者には教育でなんとかできるっていう話だったと思ったんですけど、その中高年代、私たちの親の世代とかの年代にはどうやって浸透させていくんですかね。
Another really brilliant question, right? Because when I went to school, I didn't learn any of these things at all. But of course, we have a generation of young people who are coming through schools with these empowering belief systems that maybe they go into the workplace or they go into other parts of society and they're still sort of held back by, belief systems about gender that are limiting and from a previous generation. And that can be a challenge. But as I did mention, it is possible to change gender norms. And that starts with a conversation. And so for instance, just as an example, there is a program, very, very well researched program called the Good Schools Toolkit. It's actually from Uganda, implemented in Uganda. And their objective was to change the community norms that the community had about violence, which, they perceived as acceptable for parents to discipline their children, but we can see that that can create harm. And that intervention involved working with young people in school so that when they went into their homes, they could have conversations with their families. And it also involved having direct outreach to community leaders and where people are, whether it's in the church or the workplace. So at every opportunity, there was a moment to have conversations. And those conversations look like very different things. Sometimes they were about the evidence, about why it's harmful to use physical violence against children. Sometimes those conversations were more emotional, that this is harmful, it causes hurt, think back to your own childhood. So, in the space of a year or 2 years, you can see, and then also having conversations about what if you didn't do it this way? What if you instead disciplined your child in these other ways that did not include hitting them? And little by little, the value around this issue shifted to the older generation, so that everybody had the same value about why something was important. And that is what is required to change a belief system. We all have to arrive at valuing something in the same way, but it is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible.
ありがとうございます。では最後にもう一つくらいご質問取れたらと思うんですが、ママクエスチョンどなたかいらっしゃいますか？はい、どうぞお願いします。
Thank you for your lecture. It was amazing. And I have a question about that you mentioned about that sexual disease was one of the listing that student wanted to learn at school. So may I ask why it happens? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question again. It's really interesting because there's so much evidence that shows that having correct sexuality information, education, makes a difference to things like STI, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV. Having correct knowledge and skills does that. Unfortunately, too much of what young people experience in school around sexuality education is fear, is looking at sex with a lens of fear. I must not have sex because I could get a disease or I could get early pregnancy. And those conversations sort of create this negative feeling towards sexuality education. And it also means that students may have questions in the class that they want to ask, but the focus is on, don't have sex. Don't have sex. Just basically don't have sex, okay, until you're married. So the whole framing of the conversation is very, very limited and negative. However, young people do want to learn that information. We see that in other surveys as well, because when they're ready to have sex, they want to do it safely, and they want to know who they can go to and trust to ask the questions. But side by side, when we look at the many different kinds of topics that young people are interested to learn about sexuality, in country after country, survey after survey, they want to learn about relationships all the time. They want to learn about healthy relationships, and they want to understand questions around gender, including when they see peers in their learning environment who express their gender identity differently. How can they navigate that? How can they be a good friend? How to do it correctly? Those are the conversations because they don't have them, but they're surrounded by those issues in society. They want more information about and from a trusted source.
ありがとうございます。では、あともう二方ほどお手を挙げていただいたので、よろしければ再度挙げていただけたらぜひと思うんですけど、こちらの奥にいらっしゃいますかね。で今マイク参りますので少々お待ちください。
Thank you for your lecture, which is very amazing. So my question is that, I think both CIC and gender transformative is something we do want, but how can we get started in some countries that has, say, toxic political and social environment? For example, maybe an authoritarian regime, and there in some countries there are anti-gender movement that are endorsed by local government and religious groups. So, how can we get started in those areas?
Thank you for that question. This is really, this is the reality, right? This is the reality when we talk about young people everywhere deserve this. But young people everywhere have very different situations. In some countries, people's identities are criminalized for being gender non-binary. In some countries, discussions about gender are also seen to be anti the government in some contexts. We do know that even in the most conservative setting, it is possible to teach and learn. It just means a little more creativity and a very different way of doing things. So we partner, and UNESCO directly supports CSE implementation in these very conservative regimes. Often it is not school-based CSE. Very often it is not school-based CSE. It is a lot of digital sexuality education. So content created on multiple digital platforms, whether that's social media or just traditional websites, or even things like WhatsApp groups or other kinds of telephone applications. It's content that is curated and driven by young people, but in consultation with subject matter experts. It's also content curated and implemented by teachers as well. Our office in Moscow is doing some really fantastic work that's actually structured digital content for parents to have conversations with their children about sexuality, and also for young people to have conversations with each other. In even more authoritarian regimes, it's completely under the radar. You're talking about more like solidarity groups, and in those cases, the content we would understand is not the breadth of CSC that's envisioned by the technical guidance. It's very much probably more focused, more immediate needs, HIV prevention, or access to services, reproductive health services, condoms, or other types of needs. So it's more reproductive health information. And then again, we also see, even in conservative religious settings, there are partnerships with religious faith leaders and faith-based schools even. And it involves a process of looking at the content and together with them deciding, this is what we can teach. And that's sometimes what it is. It's the conversation is, this is what we can teach. And the minimum is ensuring that content is accurate and it is not reinforcing harm. That's a big win in many countries. That if the only thing young people get is information that's accurate and not creating harm.
はい、ありがとうございます。ちょっと日本での話の紹介にもなるんですけども、日本ですとセイシルというデジタル性教育メディアというのを一緒に立ち上げてやっているところもありますし、あとは私たちフィルコンの団体でアメイズというアメリカの性教育団体が作ったビデオの日本語訳などもやっていますので、またよかったらこちらも、デジタルとか SNS を活用した性教育の事例ということでご紹介できたらなと思います。ありがとうございます。では質問、もう一方手を挙げていただいた方いらっしゃいますかね。どうでしょうか。もう一度挙げていただけると、あちらの前方ですかね。ありがとうございます。ではお願いいたします。
Thank you for your seminar. Concerning the comprehensive sexuality education, I just wondered, this is a big problem in the United States right now as well. They're trying to ban this in many states. In my state, it is banned. I was wondering, how can educators assess the effectiveness of the CSE programs in promoting the understanding and acceptance and diverse gender identities?
Yeah, so sorry, just to repeat, the specific question is the effectiveness of CSE specifically in relation to gender equality attitudes?
Yes.
Okay. This is really interesting. I mean, we know that the effectiveness of CSE objectives are well documented in other aspects, mostly reproductive health and sexually transmitted infections. But if you recall my slide around social and emotional learning, there's a huge body of evidence around what we broadly call prevention education, where social and emotional learning, so specifically collaborative learning, that is focused not just on knowledge, because knowledge by itself never changed anything, right? We can know everything to know about getting pregnant and HIV infection, and we still have sex without a condom, without knowing our partner's status. So social and emotional learning, not just knowledge, but skills and attitudes and values. And the values part requires a lot of interest, is the transformative part. Activities like journaling, like, really having people question and think about things. So we know, as proxy evidence from many other kinds of prevention curricula, whether it's drug prevention curricula or violence prevention curricula, that social and emotional learning can transform attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. In CSE, it's slightly less well studied, but the proxy evidence applies, that teaching and learning in this way. And actually, one specific sexuality education statistic was from a 2015 study by Nicole Haviland that showed that sexuality education programs that had a strong emphasis on gender and power was 5 times more effective in all of its outcome areas. So they were building up that body of evidence. But it's interesting that when it comes to school curricula, even though there are other curricula, like global citizenship education, that teach about gender equality, the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is the global authority on education monitoring, it monitors sexuality education. It monitors the extent to which schools are teaching sexuality education, because that is the curriculum vehicle for gender equality teaching and learning. And now that it's in the recommendation, it further validates this kind of education. And we know from teachers that they value teaching about gender, they just struggle with how to do it because they're not trained that way. So we're still working on that part of it.
はい、ありがとうございます。拍手でお願いいたします。会場の皆様からもとっても質問積極的にいただいてありがたいなと思っています。ジェネルさんも非常に真摯にお答えいただいて改めましてありがとうございました。それではお待たせいたしましたパネルトークの方に移ってまいりたいと思います。今回日本のアクティビストの方お二人をお招きして、ジェネルさんそして司会のお二人とのパネルトークのお時間となります。まず、パネリストのお二人のご紹介少ししながら準備を進んでいただけたらと思っております。皆様のお手元のご案内の方にでもですね詳しいプロフィールと記載がありますが、改めまして私の方からご紹介ができたらと思います。松岡壮志さんは日本の性的マイノリティに関する情報発信ということで、特に政策だったり法制度についても詳しくライターとして取り上げていただいたり、書籍を出していただいたり SNS での発信もされています。で私はですね包括的性教育とかトランスジェンダーバッシングに、対抗するための、こういったバッシングにどんなふうに答えるという Q&A の書籍も一緒に賢者のそれぞれとしてご一緒させていただいたっていうこともありまして、今回お招きさせていただきました。でもう一方、櫻井彩乃さんですね。櫻井さんは私が大学生の時から知り合っておりまして、その際は災害時の女性のためのガイドとかもね一緒に作っていったんですけれども、ジェンカレというジェンダー課題を包括的に学び、ジェンダー平等を達成していくような人たちを育てていくようなサードプレイスコミュニティの企画運営をされていらっしゃいます。男女共同参画の推進委員をされたり、政府の委員としても今ご活躍されている方となります。今日は皆さんのお話も伺えるのをとっても楽しみにしております。